"So you'll be leaving today, Margaret," my daughter-in-law said calmly, as if she were reminding me to pick up groceries instead of telling me to leave the home I had lived in for more than 40 years. And the strange part was that she said it on the morning of my 75th birthday, while two large suitcases sat neatly by the front door, like silent witnesses waiting for me to notice them. And for a moment, I simply stood there holding the hallway wall for balance, staring at those suitcases because they looked familiar. The navy one with the worn handle was the same one my late husband Arthur and I had taken on our anniversary trip to Vermont 20 years ago. And the brown leather one still had the little airport tag from a flight to Denver back when our son Daniel graduated college. And seeing them there in the entryway felt like looking at pieces of my life packed away by someone else's hands. But the house itself was quiet. Too quiet for a birthday morning, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls after something important has already happened without you. And I could smell coffee from the kitchen even though no one had asked if I wanted any. And I could hear the soft clicking sound of Lily's heels against the hardwood floor as she stepped closer behind me. Calm and composed the way she always was when she had already decided how things were going to go. And that was when I realized the suitcases weren't just sitting there by coincidence. They had been placed there deliberately, right beside the door, positioned so that the first thing I would see when I stepped into the hallway was the unmistakable message that someone had already decided I was leaving. And it took me a few seconds to understand something even stranger. The suitcases were packed. I could tell from the way the zippers were pulled tight, and the sides bulged slightly with clothes folded inside. Clothes I hadn't packed, sweaters I hadn't chosen, shoes I certainly hadn't placed in there myself, which meant someone else had gone into my room while I slept and quietly packed up my life, as if it were just another chore on a morning to-do list. And I remember glancing toward the staircase, expecting Daniel to appear and laugh and tell me it was some strange misunderstanding, because mothers always believe their sons will eventually speak up. But the stairs remained empty, and Lily's voice came again, light and reasonable, as if she were explaining something practical instead of deeply personal, telling me that the house was simply too large for someone my age, and that moving somewhere more comfortable would really be the best solution for everyone. And I could hear Daniel finally walking into the hallway behind her, but he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't even clear his throat the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. He just stood there quietly. And in that moment the silence between us felt heavier than the suitcases themselves, because this was the same hallway where I had measured Daniel's height with pencil marks when he was growing up, the same hallway where Arthur had carried Christmas trees through the door every December, the same hallway where laughter used to echo during family dinners. And now here it was on my 75th birthday, holding two packed suitcases and a message no mother ever expects to receive from her own family. And I remember looking down at those bags for a long moment. Long enough to notice the small details like the way the sunlight from the front window landed across the leather handle, and long enough to feel the strange calm that sometimes arrives when the truth finally stops hiding. Because what Lily and Daniel didn't realize in that quiet hallway was that the story of this house, and who truly belonged inside it, was not the story they believed they were writing. For several seconds no one moved, and the quiet inside the house felt almost unnatural, like the air was waiting for someone else to speak first, but neither of them did. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because families do not fall apart all at once. They drift apart in small, quiet moments that you only recognize much later. And standing there in the entryway, I suddenly remembered how different this house used to feel back when Arthur was still alive and the rooms were filled with ordinary sounds like the evening news playing in the living room or the clatter of dishes from the kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove, and Daniel used to walk through that same door every Sunday afternoon carrying grocery bags because he knew his father liked to grill even in the colder months. And sometimes I would watch them out the window while they stood on the back patio arguing about the best way to cook a steak, as if it were the most important discussion in the world. And at the time, I believed those moments would last forever, because that is the quiet promise families seem to make without saying it out loud. But things began to shift after Arthur passed away 3 years earlier, not suddenly but gradually, the way the light changes in a room as the day moves toward evening. And at first Daniel started visiting less often, because work kept him busy at the engineering firm downtown. And I understood that because raising a family and building a career can consume more hours than anyone expects. But then Lily began making more of the decisions when they visited. Small things at first, like rearranging the kitchen cabinets so the dishes were easier for her to reach, or suggesting that the guest room would make a better home office for Daniel. And I told myself those changes were harmless because a house that holds several generations always shifts a little to make space for new habits. But over time the conversations changed as well, and I noticed that whenever Daniel and I spoke about the house, Lily would listen very carefully, even when she pretended to be busy with something else. And once during dinner, she asked how much property taxes were each year and whether the maintenance costs had increased recently. And at the time her questions sounded practical, almost helpful, the kind of curiosity you might expect from someone thinking about family finances. But looking back now, I realized those conversations were not casual at all. They were quiet pieces of a larger puzzle that I had not yet seen clearly. Because Lily had a way of asking questions without revealing why she wanted the answers, and Daniel rarely interrupted her when she spoke, which was strange for a man who used to challenge every opinion when he was younger. And sometimes I would catch him glancing toward her before answering me, as if he were measuring his words against something only the two of them understood. And there were other small moments that seemed harmless at the time, but feel very different in memory. Like the afternoon Lily suggested that the upstairs bedroom might be difficult for someone my age to climb to every night. Or the evening she mentioned that many retirees enjoyed living in communities designed specifically for older adults where everything was easier and quieter. And she always spoke in the same calm, thoughtful tone that made her suggestions sound almost like kindness rather than planning. And I remember smiling politely during those conversations because mothers are very good at pretending not to notice uncomfortable things, especially when the alternative would mean questioning the intentions of their own children. But standing there in the hallway with those packed suitcases beside the door, I understood something I had refused to admit before. The conversations, the questions about taxes, the gentle suggestions about senior communities, all of it had been leading toward this moment long before I ever realized a decision had already been made about where I belonged in my own home. I finally looked up from the suitcases and turned toward Daniel, because mothers always hope that if they look directly into their son's eyes long enough, the boy they raised will appear again, somewhere behind the man he has become. But Daniel did not meet my eyes right away, and instead stared down at the floor, as if the polished would suddenly require his full attention, and Lily stood beside him with her arms folded gently across her chest. Not angry and not embarrassed either, just calm in the quiet, confident way people often look when they believe everything has already been decided. And for a moment none of us spoke, which allowed the house to settle into that heavy silence again, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be, like the ticking of the old clock in the living room that Arthur bought during a summer road trip through Pennsylvania many years ago. And I realized that the clock had been ticking steadily through all the conversations I had remembered earlier, through every quiet suggestion and every polite question about property taxes and senior living communities, measuring time, while a plan slowly formed around me, without my noticing it clearly enough to stop it. And Lily finally broke the silence by stepping a little closer and speaking in the same patient tone she used whenever she explained something she believed was perfectly reasonable, saying that Daniel and she had been discussing the future of the house, and that they both agreed it would be easier for everyone if I moved somewhere more suitable for someone my age, somewhere with fewer stairs and less responsibility. And she spoke the words carefully, as if they had been rehearsed more than once before this morning. And Daniel nodded slightly while she talked, but still did not look directly at me, which felt strangely more painful than the words themselves, because silence can sometimes feel like agreement even when no one says it out loud. And I asked a simple question then, the kind of question that does not raise its voice but still changes the direction of a conversation. I asked when exactly they had decided this plan. And Lily answered quickly that they had only been thinking about it for a little while, and that they believed it would be best to act sooner rather than later so that everything could be arranged smoothly. And I noticed she said everything could be arranged as if my life were a set of boxes already scheduled for delivery somewhere else. And Daniel finally spoke then, but his voice sounded distant, like someone reading lines from a script he had already accepted, saying that the house was difficult to maintain, and that they were only trying to help me transition into something more comfortable. And I remember feeling a strange calm spread through me while he talked, because when you reach a certain age you begin to recognize when people are explaining something rather than asking. and explanations usually mean the decision has already been made without you. And I glanced down again at the two suitcases beside the door and noticed the careful way they had been positioned, not tossed aside or hurriedly packed, but placed neatly where anyone entering the hallway would see them immediately. And that detail told me more than their words had, because packing someone else's belongings requires time and intention. Someone had gone upstairs into my room, opened my dresser drawers, folded my clothes, chosen which shoes I would take and which memories would stay behind in the closet, and those quiet choices do not happen suddenly on a birthday morning. They happen after long conversations that take place somewhere else, and I looked back at Daniel then and realized something else that felt even heavier than the suitcases themselves. He truly believed this plan made sense, because people can convince themselves that removing someone from a situation is an act of kindness if they describe it carefully enough, and Lily placed her hand gently on his arm as if reinforcing that belief. And she said that they had even researched several beautiful retirement communities within 20 miles of the city where residents enjoyed social activities and comfortable apartments and friendly neighbors. And she spoke about those places the way real estate agents describe new developments, with smooth confidence and pleasant details. And while she spoke, I began to understand that this moment had not arrived unexpectedly for them at all. It had been approaching quietly for months, perhaps longer. And they were now simply presenting the final step of a plan they believed was practical, thoughtful, and already settled. And the most remarkable part was that neither of them realized how much of the real story about this house they had never truly learned. I did not answer Lily right away, because sometimes the most important moments in life deserve a few seconds of silence before you decide which words belong there. And while she continued describing those pleasant retirement communities with tidy lawns and organized social calendars, I let my eyes wander through the house that had been my world for decades, past the staircase Daniel used to slide down when he was a boy, past the living room doorway where Arthur and I had placed our first Christmas tree in this house more than 40 years earlier. And standing there, I remembered the day Arthur brought me to see this place for the very first time, back when the paint was faded and the porch steps creaked with every footstep. And most people would have called it an old house that needed too much work, but Arthur looked at it the way some people look at an empty canvas, full of possibilities waiting patiently for someone to believe in them. And I remember him standing right where Daniel was standing now, pointing toward the windows and explaining how the afternoon sunlight would fall across the living room once the trees were trimmed. And he told me that a house is never really about walls or roofs or property lines. It is about the years of ordinary life that slowly gather inside it until the place begins to hold memories the way a book holds stories. And over the next several years, we painted every room ourselves, sometimes working late into the night with music playing on the radio, while Daniel slept upstairs. And Arthur built the shelves in the study with his own hands on a Saturday afternoon when Daniel was 10 years old, measuring each board twice because he said anything worth building deserved patience. And I could almost see those moments again while Lily talked beside me in the hallway, describing how peaceful life would be somewhere smaller and easier. And the strange thing was that her voice sounded sincere, because people often believe they are being helpful when they simplify someone else's life without understanding what they are removing in the process. And I thought about the garden in the backyard where Arthur planted the maple tree the year Daniel started high school, a small sapling, then barely taller than the fence. And now its branches stretch wide enough to shade half the lawn during the summer afternoons. And every fall the leaves turn a deep red that Arthur used to call the color of October itself. And I wondered if Lily had noticed that tree, or if to her, it was simply part of the landscaping that came with the property. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly beside her, as if he expected me to argue or protest. But the truth was that anger rarely solves anything in moments like this, because anger only confirms the assumptions people have already made about you. And instead, I simply listened while Lily finished explaining how they had researched several excellent places within a reasonable driving distance, and how many residents enjoyed the comfort of having staff available for everyday needs. And the more she spoke, the more I understood that she believed she was presenting a generous solution, something thoughtful and responsible. And Daniel nodded again as she talked, the same quiet nod he had used earlier, and I realized that he was not trying to be cruel. He had simply allowed himself to believe the version of the story Lily had carefully built over time, a story where moving me somewhere else was practical and necessary. And for a moment, I felt a small wave of sadness. passed through me not because of the suitcases or even the plan itself, but because neither of them seemed to recognize the deeper history standing around us in that hallway. The decades of work, laughter, and quiet evenings that had shaped this house long before Lily ever walked through its door. And I gently placed my hand on the worn handle of the navy suitcase beside me and wondered how many other details about this home they had misunderstood while they were making their plans. I kept my hand resting on the handle of the navy suitcase for a moment longer, feeling the familiar worn leather beneath my fingers, and I realized that Lily had stopped talking because she was waiting for a reaction, the kind of reaction people expect when they believe they are presenting news that might upset someone. But the truth was that I did not feel the anger she probably anticipated. Instead, I felt something quieter and far more steady, the kind of calm that appears when a person suddenly understands a situation much more clearly than the people standing across from them. And I looked at Daniel again, and this time, he finally met my eyes for a brief second before glancing away, and that small movement told me that somewhere inside him there was still a trace of the boy who used to run through this house with muddy shoes after playing in the backyard. The boy who once asked me how a maple tree could grow so tall when it started from something smaller than a coin, and I remembered kneeling beside him in the grass that afternoon, explaining that trees grow slowly because they spend years building strong roots where no one can see them. And standing there in the hallway, I realized that families are not very different from trees. The strength of what you see above the ground always depends on the unseen foundation beneath it. And Lily cleared her throat gently and said that they had already spoken with a manager at one of the retirement communities nearby, and that an apartment could be available within a few weeks. And she added that they had taken the time to pack my things carefully so that the transition would be easier for me. And I nodded slowly as she spoke, because I could tell she believed that every detail she mentioned made the situation more reasonable, more organized, almost considerate. And Daniel finally added that the place they had found included transportation services and social events that many residents enjoyed, as if the promise of card games and afternoon exercise classes might somehow replace 40 years of living in a home filled with personal history. And I let him finish before speaking because interruptions often make people defensive, and when I finally did speak, my voice sounded calm even to my own ears, which seemed to surprise both of them slightly. And I asked them how long they had been planning all of this, not accusingly, but with the same curiosity someone might use when asking about a trip that had been carefully arranged in advance. And Lily hesitated just long enough for the truth to reveal itself in the pause before she answered that they had begun discussing it several months earlier after noticing how much work the house required. And I could see Daniel nod again beside her, as if confirming that explanation. And I realized then that this moment had likely been rehearsed many times between them, perhaps during quiet evenings when they believed I was already asleep upstairs. And I imagined the conversations where they discussed property taxes and maintenance costs and the convenience of smaller living spaces, building their plan piece by piece until it felt completely logical to them. And the strange thing was that they were not entirely wrong about the effort it takes to maintain a house like this, because the roof had needed repairs 2 winters earlier and the old furnace had finally been replaced the previous fall. But houses have always required work, and Arthur used to say that caring for a home was simply another way of caring for the life that happened inside it. And Lily shifted her weight slightly, as if she expected me to object or argue. But instead I looked down at the suitcases again and noticed something that made me almost smile. The small brass tag Arthur had attached to the Navy suitcase years ago still carried our last name engraved in careful letters, and seeing that detail reminded me of something Arthur once told me during one of our long evening conversations after Daniel had gone to bed. He said that when people make plans about property, they often focus only on what they believe they own without understanding the full story behind it. And standing there in that quiet hallway, I realized that Lily and Daniel had spent months planning a future based on assumptions they had never truly questioned. And the remarkable part was that neither of them seemed to realize that the foundation of their plan rested on an understanding of this house that was not entirely correct. The hallway remained quiet after Lily finished speaking, and I could tell that both of them believed the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, as if the plan had been explained clearly enough that the only reasonable response left for me was acceptance. And I slowly lifted the Navy suitcase by its handle, not because I intended to carry it anywhere, but because sometimes the smallest actions reveal the truth hidden inside a moment, and the weight of it told me that Lily had packed far more than just a few clothes. She had packed winter sweaters, shoes, probably the framed photograph of Arthur and me from our trip to Vermont, the same photograph that used to sit on the dresser beside my bed, and I imagined her standing in my bedroom sometime earlier that morning, opening drawers that Arthur had built with his own hands decades ago, selecting which parts of my life would travel with me and which would remain behind in this house. And the thought did not make me angry the way it might have years ago. Instead, it made me curious about something much more important than the suitcases themselves, because plans that are built on assumptions usually collapse the moment someone questions the foundation beneath them. And I set the suitcase back down gently beside the door and looked at Daniel again, noticing the faint lines near his eyes that had appeared during the past few years, lines that made him look older than I sometimes expected when I remembered the young man who once asked me to help him practice job interview questions in the kitchen late at night. And I asked him a simple question then, one that seemed almost unrelated to everything Lily had been explaining. I asked him when was the last time he had spoken with Robert Caldwell, and Daniel blinked slightly, as if the name had arrived in the conversation from somewhere unexpected, and Lily turned her head toward him with the same puzzled expression, because the two of them clearly had not expected that question to appear in this moment. And Daniel said that he had not spoken with Robert in years, not since shortly after Arthur passed away. And that answer confirmed something I had already suspected, because Robert had been Arthur's attorney for more than 3 decades, and he had handled every important document related to this house. The mortgage when we first purchased it, the paperwork when the property taxes were reassessed, and later the legal arrangements Arthur insisted on organizing during the final year of his life. And I remembered sitting beside Arthur at the dining room table one evening, while Robert explained those documents in careful detail, Arthur listening with the quiet focus he always had whenever something important needed to be done correctly. And I realized that Daniel and Lily had probably never seen those papers themselves. They had simply assumed that the house belonged to Daniel in the same natural way that many adult children assume they will eventually inherit the homes where they grew up. And assumptions can be very powerful things when no one stops to examine them closely. And Lily asked cautiously why I had mentioned Robert's name, and whether there was something I wanted to discuss with him now, and I could hear a small trace of uncertainty in her voice for the first time since the conversation began. And I simply answered that Robert had always been very thorough about making sure every detail regarding this house was properly documented, and that sometimes it is helpful to review important documents before making decisions that affect several people at once. And Daniel shifted his weight again beside her, as if he were beginning to sense that the situation might not be as straightforward as they had believed only a few minutes earlier. And I noticed the old clock in the living room ticking steadily in the background while the three of us stood there in the hallway, the same clock that had measured time through every quiet change in this house for decades. And for the first time that morning, I saw a small flicker of doubt appear in Lily's expression, the kind of doubt that begins when someone realizes that the story they have been relying on might not include every important chapter. I noticed the doubt in Lily's eyes the moment I mentioned Robert Caldwell, and doubt has a way of changing the atmosphere in a room faster than any argument ever could, because once uncertainty enters a conversation, people begin to reconsider every assumption that brought them there. And Lily glanced briefly toward Daniel, as if searching for reassurance. But Daniel did not answer the look the way he usually did when they silently checked each other's reactions. Instead, he kept watching me with a growing confusion. That reminded me very much of the way he used to look at a difficult math problem when he was in middle school, studying the numbers carefully because he sensed there was something about the situation he had misunderstood. And Lily cleared her throat gently before speaking again, this time with less confidence than before, asking why I believed it would be necessary to involve a lawyer in what she described as a simple family decision. And the way she said the word simple made me realize that she still believed this was only a matter of logistics, of moving boxes and finding a smaller apartment somewhere nearby. And I took a slow breath before answering, because the truth is easier to understand when it is spoken calmly rather than dramatically. And I told them that Robert had been more than just Arthur's attorney. He had also been the person Arthur trusted most when it came to organizing the legal details of our life together, especially during the last year when Arthur knew his health was beginning to fail. and Daniel shifted slightly when I mentioned his father because Arthur's absence still carried a quiet weight inside this house, even after 3 years. And I continued explaining that Arthur had always been the kind of man who believed that important matters should be settled clearly so that no one would face confusion later. And that belief was the reason he spent several afternoons meeting with Robert at the dining room table while I brought them coffee and listened as they reviewed documents that described exactly how certain things would be handled in the future. And Lily's expression grew more attentive as I spoke, because she could hear the direction the conversation was beginning to move. And Daniel finally asked what those documents had to do with the decision they were trying to make now, and I answered him honestly by saying that those documents described the legal ownership of this house in very precise terms. And the moment I said the word ownership, the silence returned to the hallway in a way that felt very different from before, because now the quiet carried a question neither of them had asked yet, but both of them were beginning to consider. And Lily spoke first, asking whether the house had not always been intended to belong to Daniel eventually. And I smiled slightly at the word eventually, because it revealed the assumption that had quietly supported their entire plan, the belief that the house already belonged to Daniel in some practical sense, and that my presence here was simply a temporary stage before that transition happened. And I explained gently that eventual inheritance and present ownership are not the same thing, especially when lawyers are involved in writing the documents. And Daniel looked toward the suitcases beside the door and then back at me as if he were suddenly seeing the situation from a completely different angle, and I realized that the calm certainty Lily had shown earlier had begun to fade into careful uncertainty. And I walked slowly toward the living room doorway and glanced at the old clock on the wall, listening to the steady rhythm of its ticking while I chose my next words carefully, because once certain truths are spoken, they change the shape of a conversation forever. And I told them that Arthur had made several very deliberate decisions about this house during his final year, decisions that Robert had written into legal documents that still existed exactly as they had been signed. And Lily asked quietly what those decisions were, and I could hear the first trace of genuine concern in her voice, the kind that appears when someone begins to suspect that the foundation beneath their plan may not be as solid as they believed. And I answered that the details were written clearly in the documents Robert kept in his office downtown, and that perhaps it would be wise for all of us to review them together before anyone continued packing suitcases that might not belong where they currently stood. The moment the words about reviewing the documents left my mouth, the hallway grew even quieter than before, and I could almost hear the thoughts moving behind Daniel's eyes while he tried to understand what I was implying, because uncertainty has a way of slowing time inside a room, stretching every second into something heavier than it was a moment earlier. And Lily looked toward the suitcases beside the door as if seeing them differently now, no longer as symbols of a simple plan, but as objects that might have been placed there too soon. And she asked carefully what exactly those documents said, her voice steady but softer than before, and I could tell she was trying to measure how serious this conversation had become. And I answered slowly, because truth does not need to hurry, explaining that Arthur had always believed that the most important responsibility of a husband and father was to protect the stability of his family even after he was gone. And during the final year of his life, he spent many evenings thinking about what would happen to this house and to the life that had grown inside it. And Daniel shifted slightly when I mentioned those evenings, because he remembered them too. The quiet nights when Arthur sat at the dining room table with a yellow legal pad making notes about repairs that needed to be finished and bills that should never fall behind. And I continued by saying that those meetings with Robert Caldwell had not been casual conversations, but formal legal discussions where every detail about the house was written down clearly so that no confusion would ever appear later. And Lily asked if those papers changed something about who owned the property now, and the careful way she asked the question told me that she was beginning to see the possibility that the story she believed might not be complete. And I walked slowly toward the small cabinet in the living room where Arthur used to keep several important envelopes. The cabinet had been there for decades, and its wood still carried faint scratches from the time Daniel tried to build a toy airplane on the floor beside it when he was 9 years old. And I opened the cabinet drawer and took out a thin folder that Robert had given me shortly after Arthur passed away, not because I needed to show it to them immediately, but because holding it reminded me that Arthur had been very deliberate about the future. And I turned back toward them and explained that the Documents Robert prepared were very clear about one thing above all else. Arthur wanted to make sure that the person who had built a life in this house beside him would never be forced to leave it against her will. And Daniel's expression changed slightly when he heard those words, the confusion on his face slowly mixing with a realization that had not occurred to him before. And Lily asked quietly if that meant the house still legally belonged to me. And I did not answer right away because sometimes people understand the truth more clearly when they arrive at it themselves. And the clock in the living room ticked steadily, while both of them considered the possibility that the foundation of their plan had been built on an assumption that was never actually written anywhere. And after a moment Daniel spoke again, and his voice sounded very different from earlier, less certain, asking why he had never heard about those documents before. And I told him that Arthur had always believed that inheritance should be discussed only when the time was appropriate, not years in advance when people might misunderstand what those decisions really meant. And I added gently that Arthur trusted Daniel enough to believe he would never rush to claim something that was meant to protect his mother's home first. And Lily looked down at the suitcases again, and I could see the confidence she had carried earlier slowly dissolving into careful thought, because plans that seem perfectly reasonable often fall apart the moment someone reads the documents that explain who truly holds the key to the door. I watched the realization slowly settle across Daniel's face the way sunlight moves across a room in the late afternoon, gradual and impossible to ignore once it reaches the center. And for the first time since this conversation began, he looked not at Lily, but directly at me, as if he were searching for confirmation that the quiet truth forming in his mind was actually real. And Lily remained still beside him, although the confidence she carried earlier had clearly begun to dissolve into something more cautious, and the suitcases by the door suddenly looked less like a plan and more like a question neither of them knew how to answer yet. And Daniel finally spoke in a voice that sounded slower than before, asking if Arthur had really arranged things so that the house belonged to me completely, not just temporarily, but legally and fully. And I nodded gently because the answer did not require drama or raised voices. It had been written clearly on paper years ago by people who understood exactly how the law worked. And I explained that when Arthur met with Robert Caldwell during those final months, he insisted on one simple principle, that the house where we built our life together would always remain my home for as long as I chose to live in it, without pressure, without conditions, and without anyone else having the authority to decide otherwise. And the hallway fell silent again when those words settled into the air, because the meaning behind them was impossible to misunderstand. And Lily looked down at the suitcases once more, and I could almost see the calculations changing in her mind. The careful plan she had built over months rearranging itself into something very different now that the legal foundation beneath it had shifted, and Daniel rubbed his hand slowly across the back of his neck the way he used to when he realized he had made a mistake during his teenage years. And I remembered a moment long ago when he accidentally broke one of Arthur's tools in the garage and stood there looking almost exactly the same, unsure how to explain what had happened, but already understanding that the situation was not what he believed it had been a few minutes earlier. And Lily finally asked if there was any possibility that the documents allowed Daniel to take ownership after certain conditions were met, perhaps after I moved somewhere else or chose not to live here anymore. And her question was careful, but the intention behind it was clear. She was searching for a detail that might still support the plan they had created. And I answered honestly that Robert had explained the documents very carefully and that they left no room for misunderstanding. The house belonged to me now and would remain under my control unless I personally decided to transfer it to someone else. And I added gently that Arthur had been very specific about that point, because he wanted to make sure no one would ever feel entitled to make decisions about this home without my agreement. And Daniel looked toward the living room doorway as if trying to see the house through a completely different lens than before. And perhaps in that moment he finally understood something that had been invisible to him for years, that growing up inside a place does not automatically make it yours, because ownership is not built from memories alone, but from the legal promises people choose to leave behind. And the ticking clock continued marking each second while the three of us stood there surrounded by the quiet weight of that realization. And Lily took a slow breath before speaking again, asking whether I was saying that the plan they had arranged could not move forward unless I agreed to it. And I told her calmly that plans involving someone's home should always begin with that person's agreement rather than end with it. and the hallway felt different then, not tense but balanced in a way it had not been earlier. Because the moment the truth became clear, the suitcases by the door no longer represented my departure at all. They simply stood there waiting for the people who had packed them to decide what they truly intended to do next. I could see Daniel thinking carefully now in a way he had not earlier that morning. The kind of quiet thinking that happens when someone realizes a situation is far more complicated than they believed only a few minutes before. And Lily remained beside him with her arms folded again, although the gesture no longer carried the quiet authority it had at the beginning of our conversation. Because certainty had been replaced by caution, and the suitcases by the door suddenly looked like misplaced objects from a different version of the day, a version where assumptions had never been questioned. And Daniel finally spoke again, asking whether I had known about Arthur's legal arrangements all along or if Robert had explained them only after Arthur passed away. And I told him that Arthur had insisted I understand everything while he was still alive, because he believed that clarity protects families from misunderstandings. And I remembered sitting beside Arthur at the dining room table while Robert spread several papers across the polished wood surface and explained each section slowly. Arthur listening carefully while the late afternoon sunlight came through the window and rested across the maple tree in the backyard. And Robert had said something that stayed with me ever since. He said that homes often become the center of complicated emotions when people assume ownership instead of reading the documents that define it. And standing there in the hallway years later, I realized how accurate that observation had been, because Daniel had never intended to cause harm. He had simply believed a story about the future that seemed natural to him. And Lily had built her plan on that same belief, adding practical details and confident suggestions until the idea felt completely logical. And now that logic was shifting beneath them in ways they had not anticipated, and Lily finally asked whether I was planning to call Robert immediately to review the documents with him. And I told her calmly that there was no urgency, because the papers had already been signed and filed properly years ago, and the law does not change simply because someone makes a different plan in a hallway on a quiet morning. And Daniel walked a few steps toward the living room and looked around the house as if seeing it through a new perspective, perhaps remembering the same moments I had remembered earlier. The summers when Arthur grilled in the backyard while Daniel ran through the sprinkler, the winter evenings when we watched snow settle on the porch while the furnace hummed steadily in the basement. And I could tell that the idea of suddenly rearranging all of that history felt different to him now that he understood the truth behind the ownership of the house. And Lily looked down again at the suitcases before asking quietly whether I believed they had been disrespectful by packing my things without asking first. And her voice carried less confidence than before, because she could sense that the balance of the conversation had shifted. And I answered gently that respect inside a family often depends less on the action itself, and more on whether people speak honestly before making decisions that affect someone else's life. And I added that if they had come to me weeks earlier and asked how I felt about the future of the house, we could have discussed many possibilities together. But packing suitcases first had created a moment that none of us would easily forget. And Daniel nodded slowly at those words because he understood the difference immediately, and the quiet hallway that had once felt tense now seemed calmer in a different way. Not because the situation had been resolved, but because the truth had finally been placed where everyone could see it clearly. And the suitcases by the door no longer looked like the beginning of my departure. They looked like a reminder that decisions made without understanding often lead people to the wrong doorway altogether. I watched Daniel continue looking around the living room as if he were walking through memories that had suddenly become more fragile than he expected. And for a moment, the only sound in the house was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. Ordinary sounds that had always belonged to this house long before any conversation about leaving had ever been imagined. And Lily stood quietly beside the suitcases now without touching them, the confidence that had guided her earlier plans replaced by careful reflection. And I realized that the moment had shifted from confrontation to understanding in a way none of us had predicted when the morning began. And Daniel finally turned back toward me with an expression that looked both thoughtful and uneasy. The way someone looks when they recognize that a decision they believed was practical may have ignored something far more important. And he said slowly that he had never meant for things to happen this way. That when Lily first suggested the idea of helping me move somewhere easier, they both believed they were being responsible about the future, thinking about maintenance costs and the effort it takes to care for an older house. And he admitted that they had spoken about it many times in private because they assumed the house would eventually belong to him anyway. And hearing that assumption out loud seemed to weigh on him now in a different way, as if he understood how easily a simple belief can grow into a plan that overlooks the person standing at the center of it. And Lily nodded gently beside him and added that she had believed organizing everything ahead of time would make the transition smoother for everyone involved, that she thought removing the stress of planning would actually be a kindness. And the honesty in her voice told me that she had not intended cruelty. She had simply mistaken preparation for permission, and I walked a few steps closer to the doorway where the suitcases rested and looked at them again, noticing how carefully the zippers had been closed and how neatly the handles were aligned toward the door. And I said quietly that intentions matter, but so does respect, because homes are not just places where people sleep and store their belongings. They are places where years of ordinary life slowly gather until the walls hold memories as clearly as photographs. And I explained that Arthur and I did not spend decades building this home simply so that it could become a convenient solution to someone else's plan. We built it so that the people inside it would always feel secure and valued. And Daniel listened carefully without interrupting, and I could see the same thoughtful patience he once had when he was a child learning how to assemble one of Arthur's model airplanes at the kitchen table, piece by piece, understanding that every small part mattered. And after a moment, he said that he wished they had spoken with me first before making assumptions about what would happen next, and Lily agreed quietly, admitting that they had allowed practicality to guide their thinking without considering how deeply connected I remained to this house and everything it represented. And the air in the hallway felt calmer now, not because every problem had been solved, but because honesty had replaced certainty. And I told them that the future of this house did not have to become a conflict if we approached it as a conversation rather than a decision already made. And I added that the real mistake was never the idea of discussing change, but the belief that such a discussion could begin with packed suitcases waiting by the door instead of with a simple question asked at the dining room table. And Daniel looked toward the suitcases once more before saying quietly that perhaps the first thing they should do was move them away from the doorway, because he finally understood that the message they had sent with those bags was never the message they truly meant to deliver. I stood quietly for a moment after Daniel spoke those words about moving the suitcases away from the doorway, and the house seemed to breathe differently around us. The tension that had filled the hallway earlier that morning slowly dissolving into something calmer and more honest. And Daniel stepped forward then and picked up the brown leather suitcase, the same one Arthur and I had once carried through airports and train stations during years when life felt wide open with possibility. And he carried it gently back toward the staircase, as if the weight inside it had suddenly become something more meaningful than just folded clothes. And Lily followed a moment later with the navy suitcase, moving more slowly now, not with the confidence she had earlier, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before. And the hallway looked strangely empty without the bags beside the door, as if the house itself had quietly corrected a mistake. And Daniel returned after setting the suitcases back upstairs, and stood in the living room for a moment looking toward the back window, where the maple tree Arthur planted years ago spread its branches across the morning light. And I could see memories moving behind his eyes, the same memories that had shaped this house long before any plans about leaving had ever been imagined. And he said softly that he had not realized how easily assumptions about the future could erase the past if no one stopped to question them. And Lily nodded beside him and admitted that she had allowed practicality to guide her thinking too far ahead of understanding, believing that organizing the next chapter of our lives would somehow make it easier for everyone involved. And I walked slowly into the living room then and rested my hand on the back of the old chair Arthur used to sit in every evening while he read the newspaper, the wood still smooth from decades of ordinary use. And I told them that change is never wrong when it is chosen together, but when it is decided in advance, it can feel like someone closing a door without asking who still lives inside the room. And Daniel listened carefully and said that if there was ever a day when I wanted to discuss the future of the house, he would be there to talk about it properly. Not with suitcases waiting by the door, but with time, patience, and respect. And Lily added that she hoped we could begin again from a different place, one where decisions were shared rather than arranged quietly in advance. And I looked around the room, then at the photographs on the mantel, at the sunlight resting on the floorboards Arthur and I had refinished ourselves so many years earlier, and I realized that the house had witnessed every chapter of our family's story, the joyful ones and the difficult ones alike. And today it had witnessed something else as well, the moment when misunderstanding gave way to truth. And I told them that Arthur once said a home is strongest not because of the wood or the walls, but because the people inside it learn how to listen to each other before making decisions that cannot easily be undone. And Daniel smiled faintly at that memory, and Lily looked toward the staircase where the suitcases had disappeared from sight, and the house returned to its familiar quiet rhythm, the clock ticking steadily as it always had. And for the first time that morning the doorway stood empty again, not as a place where someone was expected to leave, but as the same open entrance it had always been, welcoming the people inside it to begin the next chapter of their lives with a little more understanding than they had the day before.